Welcome to this second session on the Ten Commandments. Last time we were together, we looked at why we should study law, or why we should study the Ten Commandments. We then talked about natural law versus positive law. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at natural law and how it relates to the Ten Commandments or to the moral law of God. Now, to do this, we're going to go back to Romans chapter 2, and we're going to look specifically at verse 14. And we're going to look at the Ten Commandments, and is there a connection between the natural law that was written upon the heart of man in creation, stamped upon his nature, that law that corresponds to the character of God written in the heart of man? How does that law relate to the Ten Commandments? So if we look at Romans 2:14, we find this. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law, stop there. The Gentiles are the people who are outside of Israel. They are not the people of God. And the Gentiles were never given the law. Israel was given the law on Mount Sinai. God gave the law to Israel through Moses. So the Gentiles, Paul says, are those who do not have the law. So we clearly understand now that the law he's talking about is the law given by God to Israel through Moses. So here are the Gentiles who do not have the law. We're going to show that that law they don't have is the Ten Commandments. They do instinctively or by nature the things of the law. And what we know here is that Paul's talking about moral actions. Paul's not talking about Gentiles who keep dietary laws given to Israel, or keep ceremonial laws given to Israel, or even keeping the judicial laws that are given to Israel. What Paul's talking about is Gentiles who do by nature the things in the law. They know that murder is wrong. They know that stealing is wrong. So when Paul speaks here about the law and the Gentiles doing instinctively these moral actions which are in the law, they are a law to themselves in that they show the work of the law, of that moral law, written upon their hearts. Paul speaks of the law. He's talking about Gentiles keeping moral commands or having within them a sense of moral right and wrong, regulated by their conscience. So that's really interesting because last time what we talked about is that even though this moral law was written upon the heart of man in creation, because man is fallen and in sin, that law has started to diminish in its effect upon man's conscience. Man's conscience is still working, but it's being hardened, and God is giving man over to a depraved mind. But nonetheless, the evidences are still there that God placed in man a rightness and uprightness in creation that corresponded to God's holy and righteous character. That then was communicated to Israel in the law, in specifically the Ten Commandments. And so that brings us to the next question. Why did God give the Ten Commandments if the natural law was already written on man's heart? Well, the same duties toward God and man are contained both in the natural law and in the Ten Commandments. We're going to look at this in a little bit, and we're going to see how the natural law was that moral law, that uprightness of man toward God, and how the Ten Commandments are, in fact, the moral law of God. The Ten Commandments were written on tablets of stone. The natural law was written on the hearts of men. So why is it that God would then give the Ten Commandments written on stone if he already had put this same law into the hearts of men? And the answer is that there's a difference between the moral law given on Sinai and that which is natural and written on the hearts of men. And it's basically this, that the moral law given to Israel on Sinai was clear. It was without question. There was no way for it to be misunderstood, miscommunicated, or diminished over time. Whereas the natural law that had been written upon the heart of man, we saw in Romans 1:18 and 19, it was being suppressed in unrighteousness and ungodliness. That men were taking that law that had been put within them, that conscience that was working within them, and they were suppressing it. They were suppressing it so that it would no longer, they wouldn't listen and hear, and their sense of moral rightness and wrongness was diminishing. But not so with the moral law of God written on tablets of stone. We see this very same thing happening in our day. We see that man's conscience is being hardened, and that men are calling that which is evil good, and that which is good evil. And it's happening all around us. And men are rejecting the moral law of God revealed in the Ten Commandments, and they're going after things that God forbids and actually calling them good. And the people of God who hold to the law of God, which is clearly understood and communicated, they are being seen as evil. But now let's talk about the Ten Commandments and the moral law. How do we know that the Ten Commandments are the moral law? We can kind of reason from Romans chapter 2, verse 14, that Paul was talking about moral commandments when he was talking about the law. And we can reason that he's talking about moral commandments when he's talking about natural law. So the relationship between the law and natural law seems pretty clear in Romans 2:14 and 15. But how do we make the connection between the moral law, or the law of God there in Romans 2:14, and the Ten Commandments themselves? Now, this is a little bit challenging in some senses, because one of the things is there's not a scripture that simply says the Ten Commandments are the moral law of God. And yet, there are some scriptures that say almost exactly that. Let's look, for example, in Exodus 31:18, we know that the law given by God to Israel through Moses was called the tables of the testimony. We also know in Hebrews 9:4, they are called the tables of the covenant. So we know that God gave Israel the law on two tablets, and they are called the two tables of the covenant. On these two tables, we are to understand our duties to God and to man. And we're going to get to that in a second. But first, there are scholars who will say that Hittite covenants, every time a Hittite covenant was created, two copies were made, one for each party represented in the covenant. And so they'll say the two tables of the covenant are the two copies of the same thing. So the Ten Commandments were written on one table, and the Ten Commandments were written again on another table. And so there were two copies of the same thing. The problem with this is that God doesn't need a copy. And also that the two tables of the testimony are called the two tables of the testimony, or the two tables of the covenant. So this covenant or testimony had two tables, not two copies of the same thing, but two tables that make up the testimony, two tables that make up the covenant. The other thing we know about this is that both tables were placed in the Ark of the Covenant. So we're talking about one testimony in two tables put into the Ark of the Covenant. What we then find out is that these two tables represent our responsibility to God and our responsibility to our fellow man. And we understand this most clearly from the teaching of Jesus. Jesus says this in Matthew 22:37 through 40. And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Now, obviously, when Jesus says depend the whole law, he means all of the law that was given. But most importantly, he means the law given by God on Sinai to Israel through Moses. And Jesus sees that law summarized in two commandments. One, which is our duty to God, to love him with all our heart, mind, and strength. And the other, our duty to our fellow man, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And what we then see is that the first four commandments clearly delineate our obligation to God, and the last six commandments, our obligation to our fellow man. Now, one can see how the Ten Commandments are, in fact, the moral law of God just by looking at the Ten Commandments. So let's look at them real quickly as just a cursory view of the Ten Commandments. In the first table, our obligations to God, we find the first commandment, You shall have no other gods. Well, certainly this means that God is not the greatest among many. God is the only God, and He is to be the only God in our heart. So when we think about our moral obligation to God, it is that we have no other gods before Him. He alone is God. The second commandment tells us how we are to worship God. We are to have no idols. No idols translates into we are to worship God in the way that God prescribes. In other words, if we think about the fact that what is our moral obligation, it is to worship and serve God. And how should we worship and serve Him? Should we worship and serve Him the way we think best? Should we worship and serve Him the way our ancestors did? Or should we worship and serve Him the way He commands? The second commandment, you shall have no idols, tells us that we should always worship God the way He commands. The third commandment tells us to not take the name of the Lord in vain. This gives us a proper way in which we are to honor and use the holy name of God. And finally, the fourth commandment tells us to remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. This is the setting aside of solemn times of worship. That if you think about it, if we are to worship and serve God and God alone, we are to worship and serve Him in the way that He commanded. We are to revere and honor His name and not use it in vain. And we are to set aside times for worshiping Him, and we are to keep them. And the Sabbath commandment points us to that moral obligation. Now let's look at the next 6 commandments, starting with the 5th commandment. Now we're going to talk about our obligations toward our fellow man. The 5th commandment, honor your mother and father. This is virtually the foundation of all submission to authority. Whether you honor the king, respect the government, listen to the police, listen to your teachers, listen to your pastor, listen to your parents. You learned what it meant to honor those who were deserving of honor by honoring your mother and father. The 6th commandment, do not murder, forbids the taking of innocent human life. Clearly a moral command. The 7th commandment is like it, do not commit adultery. In other words, do not violate God's intention for sex only within the covenant of marriage. The 8th commandment tells us, do not steal. That is, don't take what God has given to someone else and hasn't given to you. The 9th commandment, do not lie. That is, to fail to image the one who is the truth. And finally, the 10th commandment, do not covet. Do not desire what God has not given to you, but has given to someone else. Each one of these commandments is self-evidently moral. We're talking about our moral obligation to God, and we're talking about our moral obligation toward our fellow man. And these commandments are summarized in 2 tables, one showing us our obligations to God, that we should love Him with all our heart, mind, and strength, and the other our obligations to our fellow man, that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, all laid out for us in these 10 commandments. Now, finally, I want to close with the confession, and that is, let's look at what does the confession tell us about the 10 commandments as natural law and moral law. So from the confession, the same law that was first written in the heart of man, that's natural law, continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness after the fall, though because of sin it had been marred and defaced, and was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai, that same law given on tablets of stone, in the 10 commandments, written in 2 tables, the 4 first containing our duty toward God, and the other 6 our duty to man.